Man at the window. When I was a child, we lived in an old house on the outskirts of a small town in Pennsylvania. It was the kind of place that seemed straight out of a horror story, a 19th century structure with wooden walls that creaked at the slightest touch and windows that let in the cold autumn wind. But to me, it was just the house I grew up in, full of mysteries and hidden corners that fueled my childhood imagination. I remember one night in particular that still makes me shiver, even after all these years. I was about 8 years old at the time, and as usual, I went to bed early after a long day of playing in the yard. My parents were downstairs watching TV while I tried to fall asleep. But that night, something felt different. The darkness in my room seemed denser, and the silence more oppressive. I woke up in the middle of the night with a strange feeling, as if someone was watching me. I slowly opened my eyes, trying to understand what was happening. The room was bathed in shadows, with only the faint light of the moon filtering through the curtains. I couldn't explain why, but something made me look directly at the window, as if I were being drawn by an invisible force. That's when I saw him. Outside the window, there was a man. He was standing still, and although his figure was partially covered by shadows, I could see his eyes shining in the darkness. They were eyes that didn't blink, that seemed to pierce through the glass and stab me with a cold, merciless gaze. I was frozen with fear, unable to look away or make any sound. The feeling of being watched was so intense that my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't comprehend how that man had gotten there, on the second floor of the house, just standing outside my window. He didn't do anything, just watched me, as if he were waiting for something. Each second seemed to drag on, and I felt the panic rising inside me. Finally, I gathered the strength to move. I jumped out of bed and ran to my parents' room, not caring about making noise. I burst into their room like a hurricane, waking them up in the process. I tried to explain what I had seen, but the words came out jumbled, broken by fear. My father, still half asleep, grabbed a flashlight and followed me back to my room while my mother stayed behind, looking worried. When we got to my room, the man was gone. My father shined the flashlight into the yard, but there was no sign of anyone. The dry leaves on the ground weren't even disturbed. He told me it was probably just a nightmare, that I was imagining things, but something in his expression told me he was just as unsettled as I was. Even so, he closed the curtains and assured me everything was safe before tucking me back into bed. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay under the covers, my heart racing, waiting for the man to reappear. But the night passed without further incident, and eventually, exhaustion overtook me. When I woke up the next morning, the daylight made the experience seem less real, as if it had just been a bad dream. But deep down, I knew it had been much more than that. Years went by, and that incident remained in my mind as a distant but ever-present memory. It wasn't until many years later, as an adult, that I returned to that house, now uninhabited and deteriorating with time. My parents had decided to sell it, but before that happened, I went back to help fix it up, hoping to prepare it for sale. While cleaning out the basement, which had always been a dark, avoided place for all of us, I found something that brought back all that childhood fear. Behind a brick wall that looked different from the others, we discovered a secret compartment. Inside, there was evidence that someone had lived there. I found old clothes covered in dust, remnants of food, and even a makeshift bed made of rags. The shock was immediate. That discovery brought everything I had experienced as a child rushing back. The man I saw at the window. He had really been there, it wasn't just my imagination. The idea that someone had been living inside the walls of our house, spying on us while we slept, made me feel sick. Every detail of what we found seemed to tell the story of someone who, for some reason, chose to hide in that place. As I left the basement, the air felt heavier, as if the house was soaked with the presence of that mysterious figure. We never found out who he was or how long he had lived there, but just the idea that he could have been watching me for months, maybe years, without anyone noticing, haunts me to this day. My father, seeing the compartment, went pale, speechless, but now everything made sense. That experience made me realize that some real scary stories aren't just products of our imagination. Sometimes, the terror is closer than we think, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And even after all these years, I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't run that night, if I had stayed frozen in fear and allowed that man, that presence, to enter my room. What I'm left with now are memories and the certainty that not everything can be explained. Selling the house was a relief for my family, but for me, there's a lingering feeling that part of that story remains untold. Maybe, somewhere, that man is still lurking, waiting for his next victim. And that's what makes this one of the most disturbing true horror stories I've ever lived through. Man in the Locked Door. It was an ordinary night, one of those nights when you come home after a long day at work, just looking forward to some peace and rest. I lived in an old apartment in a quiet part of the city, the kind of place where you know your neighbors and don't expect surprises. That night, however, something was different. As I approached the door to my apartment, I noticed it was slightly ajar. A detail that made me pause for a second. My first reaction was irritation. I thought maybe I had left in a hurry and forgotten to lock the door properly. I glanced down the empty hallway, and without thinking much, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The first thing I did was lock it behind me. The click of the lock gave me a fleeting sense of security. But something in the air was different, heavy. The apartment looked the same as always, but there was a strange sense of unease I couldn't explain. I looked around, trying to figure out what might be out of place, but everything seemed to be exactly where it should be. I tossed my keys on the kitchen table and headed to the living room, already convincing myself it was just my imagination. That's when I heard the footsteps. First, a slight creak, almost imperceptible, coming from the hallway that led to the bedroom. My body stiffened instantly. The sound was distinct, the kind of sound you know well when you live alone and are certain no one else is in the apartment. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if the person was trying not to make noise but failing. I grabbed the baseball bat I always kept by the door, a relic from the days when I used to play with friends. I held it tightly, feeling the adrenaline start to rush through my veins. I tried to take a deep breath, calm myself, but the sound of the footsteps continued. I started walking slowly towards the hallway, trying not to make a sound, the bat raised and ready to be used. I entered the hallway cautiously, each step feeling like an eternity. I peeked into the bedroom, but saw nothing unusual. The sound of the footsteps had stopped, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. I checked the closet, looked under the bed, but there was no one there. Even so, the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me. I returned to the living room, my heart still pounding in my chest. That's when I heard it again, this time closer. The footsteps were now coming from the other side of the apartment, the opposite side of the hallway. The sound seemed to be moving, circling around me. The thought that someone was inside my apartment, hiding, sent me into a panic. I decided I wasn't going to stay there any longer to find out who or what was causing it. I left the apartment quickly, without looking back, and ran down the stairs to the street. I called the police as soon as I got outside, trying to explain what had happened, but my words came out broken by fear. They told me to wait outside and that they would arrive soon. The minutes I waited felt like hours. I stood on the sidewalk, staring up at my apartment window, waiting to see some shadow or movement. When the police finally arrived, we went up to the apartment together. They opened the door carefully and asked me to wait in the hallway while they inspected the place. The officers took a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, one of them came back to me and asked me to come inside. When I entered, the first thing I noticed was the serious look on their faces. They led me to the attic, a small, dusty space I rarely visited. When we climbed the narrow stairs and turned on the light, what I saw made my blood run cold. In the corner of the attic, there was an old, dirty mattress, covered by a blanket that wasn't mine. Beside it, a pile of food scraps and empty wrappers, as if someone had been living there for some time. There were also marks on the wooden floor, indicating that the person moved frequently, perhaps spying through the small crack that led to the floor below. The officer explained that it was possible someone had entered the apartment and stayed hidden in the attic for days, maybe weeks. The thought that someone had been secretly living in the same space as me, spying on my life, listening to my steps, made me nauseous. They searched the entire apartment, but whoever it was had already gone, leaving only the mattress and the remains as evidence of their presence. I left the apartment that night, not knowing if I would ever feel safe there again. The idea that I was being watched, that someone was inside my personal space, was more terrifying than any horror movie. We never found out who it was or how they got in, but the marks in the attic and the old mattress were proof enough that I wasn't alone. Since then, I've moved to a new place, but the feeling of being watched has never completely gone away. Now and then, I still wake up in the middle of the night, certain I hear footsteps in the hallway, even knowing there's no one there. What scares me most isn't what I found, but what I never got to see. Because sometimes, the scariest horror stories aren't the ones we can understand, but the ones we never fully explain. Night Visitor. For months, I lived a routine that seemed perfectly normal. I had my job, my friends, and I lived in a small but cozy apartment in Seattle. It was the kind of life any young, single person could wish for. But no matter how orderly everything seemed on the surface, something began to disturb me deeply, something I can only describe as a shadow that settled into my life. It all started subtly. I've always been a deep sleeper, rarely waking up in the middle of the night. However, one night, I suddenly woke up, for no apparent reason. I looked at the clock on the nightstand and saw that it read exactly 3 a.m. I found it strange but didn't think much of it. I turned over and went back to sleep, believing it was just a coincidence. But it kept happening. Night after night, I would wake up at exactly 3 a.m., always with the feeling that something wasn't right. At first, I thought it was anxiety or some kind of accumulated work stress. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself there was nothing to worry about, but the feeling persisted and seemed to grow more intense with each passing night. Waking up in the middle of the night was already becoming a disturbing habit, but the worst was yet to come. One night, after waking up at 3 a.m. once again, I realized I wasn't alone in the room. I felt a presence, something that shouldn't have been there. My body tensed up, as if every fiber was on high alert. Slowly, I turned my head towards the corner of the room, and that's when I saw it. In the darkest corner of the room, where the light from the lamp didn't reach, there was a figure. It was tall, with vague outlines, but definitely humanoid. The most terrifying thing was the fact that it was watching me. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was watching me. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move a muscle. All I could do was stare back, trying to understand what was happening. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, still, watching me. With each passing second, the terror grew inside me. Minutes dragged on like hours, until suddenly, the figure began to fade, as if it were dissolving into the darkness. When it finally disappeared completely, the room was absurdly silent, as if the air was charged with something invisible but oppressive. The next morning, I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. I spent the day trying to rationalize what had happened. I thought it could have been sleep paralysis, a phenomenon I had heard of before, where people wake up and, for a moment, can't move, often seeing terrifying figures that aren't real. But even as I tried to convince myself of this, something didn't fit. That figure felt so real, so present. The following nights were even worse. Even when I managed to sleep, I felt the presence, as if something was there with me, watching me in the dark. And this feeling was no longer limited to 3 a.m. I began to feel it during the day too, as if someone was always lurking, watching me from afar. I started avoiding being alone in the apartment, but even with friends around, the feeling didn't go away. I began to think I was going crazy. My productivity at work plummeted, and my friends noticed I was different. I tried to seek help, talking to a therapist, but it was hard to explain what was happening without sounding irrational. Most people advised me to rest, to get away from stress, but nothing seemed to work. Things got so bad that I started avoiding my own bedroom. I began sleeping on the couch, with all the lights on, hoping it would keep the figure away. But the feeling of being watched didn't lessen, and my mental state was deteriorating rapidly. I knew I couldn't continue like this for much longer. Finally, I made a drastic decision, to move. I didn't know if it was the apartment, the place, or something I had done, but I knew I needed to get out of there. I found a new place in another part of the city, and within weeks, I was settled into a completely different environment. The first few nights in the new apartment were strange, but to my relief, the feeling of being watched didn't follow me. However, even after the move, what happened still haunts me. I can't rationally explain what that figure was, or why I woke up so many nights in a row at 3 a.m. Some nights, I still wake up at the same time, with a brief moment of panic before realizing where I am. The feeling of being watched, although it has lessened, never completely disappeared. I shared this story on Reddit, hoping to find some explanation or at least someone who had gone through something similar. The responses ranged from supernatural theories to psychological explanations, but none gave me a definitive answer. All I know is that, for some reason, during that time in my life, I was being watched by something I can't comprehend. Now, even in a new apartment, in a new neighborhood, there are still nights when I feel I'm not alone. And no matter how much I try to put this experience behind me, part of me knows that feeling will never completely go away. Maybe I'll never find out what really happened, but I know that for the rest of my life, I'll wonder if that figure will find me again. And if it does, will I be ready? That's a question that still terrifies me. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more creepy stories just like these. And hey, have you ever had a paranormal experience? Drop a comment below and share your story with us, we'd love to hear it. Now, let's dive into the next story. Intruder in the house. Living alone for the first time was an exciting experience for me. At 21, I had just moved into a small apartment on the ground floor of an old house in a quiet neighborhood in Portland, Oregon. Independence was something I had always wanted, and that place seemed perfect. The house was divided into 2 units. I occupied the ground floor, while the upstairs was rented by a tenant I rarely saw. Everything was peaceful until one ordinary night turned into something I could never forget. That night, I decided to watch a horror movie, something I always enjoyed doing, especially when I was alone. The atmosphere was perfect for it. A light rain tapped against the windows, and the wind blew softly, creating an ideal setting for a night of scares. I chose one of those classic films, full of suspense and sudden appearances, and settled on the couch with a bucket of popcorn beside me. As the movie progressed, I felt that familiar tension building. The scenes became increasingly intense, and I was completely immersed in the story. But suddenly, something broke the immersion. In the middle of a particularly scary scene, I heard a strange noise coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the sound from the movie, but the noise continued even after I paused it. It was a low sound, almost like a whisper, something lightly scratching the floor. My heart started to race, but I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, fueled by the atmosphere of the movie. I carefully got up from the couch, still a bit hesitant, and walked towards the hallway to investigate. The sound had stopped, and everything seemed normal. I sighed with relief, thinking maybe the wind had moved something in the house. I returned to the couch, ready to continue the movie, but that's when I saw her. At the end of the hallway, there was a figure standing. A woman, motionless, staring at me in the dim light. My heart nearly stopped. The hallway was poorly lit, but I could clearly see her silhouette. She wore a dark dress, and her long hair fell over her face. For a moment, I thought I was still caught in the movie, that it couldn't be real. But panic set in when I realized it wasn't an illusion. She didn't move for what felt like an eternity. She just stood there, staring at me, as if waiting for me to do something. I tried to scream, but my voice seemed trapped in my throat. I was completely paralyzed with fear. Finally, as if something had awakened her, she started running towards me. The sound of her footsteps echoed down the hallway, getting faster and louder. I don't know how I did it, but somehow my legs responded, and I ran for the front door. I rushed out of the house without a second thought, the terror propelling me forward until I found myself on the sidewalk, out of breath and trembling. The rain was heavier now, and I felt the cold seep into my bones, but the fear was stronger than any physical sensation. I looked back at the house, expecting to see the woman coming after me, but everything was quiet. I stood there in the rain, trying to understand what had just happened. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely pull my phone out of my pocket to call the police. When I finally managed to dial, my mind was still in shock. I told them what had happened, trying to stay calm, but it was impossible to hide the fear in my voice. They said they would send a patrol car immediately. The minutes that passed until the police arrived were the longest of my life. I stood outside, watching the house as if it were alive, as if it could attack me at any moment. When the patrol car finally arrived, the officers quickly got out and began to search the place. I stayed on the street, watching as they checked every corner of the house. After a few minutes, one of the officers came over to me. He had a serious expression but was trying to reassure me. "We didn't find anyone inside," he said, which only confused me more. How could there be no one? I was sure of what I had seen, of what I had felt. But then, another patrol car arrived, and this time, they brought someone with them. It was a man, maybe in his 30s, whom I vaguely recognized. He was the upstairs tenant, someone I rarely saw but had never really spoken to. The officer explained that the woman who had broken into my apartment was his ex-girlfriend. She was in a disturbed emotional state and had somehow gotten into the house, believing she was after him. When she realized she had made a mistake, she fled. The news left me stunned. The terror I felt when I saw that woman standing at the end of the hallway didn't fade easily. Knowing she was looking for someone else and had entered the wrong place by mistake didn't make the fear disappear. On the contrary, it only heightened my discomfort about being in that place. The reality that someone could enter my home so easily haunted me deeply. That night, after the police left, I knew I couldn't sleep in that apartment. I packed some clothes and went to a friend's house, where I stayed for the next few days. The thought of returning to that house gave me chills, and I decided I needed to find another place to live. What was supposed to be the start of an exciting chapter in my life had turned into a nightmare I didn't want to relive. Eventually, I found a new place, an apartment in a building with better security, where I felt more protected. But the memories of that night stay with me, a constant reminder of how fragile safety is, and how sometimes, terror can creep into our lives in unexpected ways. Since then, I've never been able to watch a horror movie the same way again. Mother and daughter camping and the mysterious motorcyclist. I've always been a strong person, the kind who doesn't get intimidated easily. I grew up in a small town in rural Oregon, where I learned early on how to handle the challenges of country life. When my daughter, Emily, was born, I wanted to make sure she had a childhood full of adventure. That's why weekend camping trips became something we did regularly. But one of those trips, in particular, left a mark on me in a way I never imagined. I chose a remote spot for our camp, an area in a state park that was rarely visited by tourists. The idea was simple: spend 2 days away from everything, just the two of us, surrounded by nature. We arrived at the campsite around noon, set up the tent, and spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the surrounding forest. Emily, at 7 years old, was beaming, discovering wildlife with contagious enthusiasm. The night fell peacefully. After we had dinner by the campfire, I told Emily stories until she fell asleep. The sky was incredibly clear, the stars seemed closer than ever, and the gentle sounds of the forest lulled me as I prepared to sleep. I got into the tent next to Emily, feeling at peace, but that peace didn't last long. In the middle of the night, I was awakened by a distant sound. It was the roar of an engine, initially so faint I thought I was dreaming. But the sound continued, growing louder, until it was clear it was a motorcycle. I opened my eyes and lay still, trying to understand why someone would be riding a motorcycle in such a remote place, in the middle of the night. The sound of the engine didn't fade away. In fact, it seemed to be circling our campsite, as if the rider was driving around us. I felt a chill run down my spine, and a bad feeling took hold of me. I thought about stepping out of the tent to confront whoever it was, but something inside me said not to. Something told me this person wasn't there by chance. As the sound continued, memories from the past began to surface in my mind. I remembered a man I had met when I was 19, a motorcyclist who became a frightening presence in my life. At first, it seemed like just a casual relationship, but he turned out to be possessive and dangerous. When I tried to distance myself, he stalked me for months until I finally managed to get away from him, or so I thought. As the roar of the motorcycle echoed through the forest, I realized that sound was all too familiar. Could he have found me after all these years? The thought terrified me. I was alone with Emily, in a place where no one could help us if something went wrong. And the only thing I knew at that moment was that stepping out of the tent wasn't a safe option. The sound of the motorcycle finally stopped, but the quiet that followed was even more unsettling. I remained still, listening, waiting for any sign that the motorcyclist was still nearby. The silence was almost unbearable, and every second felt like an eternity. When the engine finally roared back to life, this time moving away, I felt relieved, but the fear didn't completely disappear. The next day, I didn't tell Emily what had happened. She woke up excited, ready for another day of adventure, and I didn't want to scare her. However, what happened that night remained etched in my mind, and the feeling that we were being watched didn't leave me. As we packed up the camp, I kept glancing at the dirt road in the distance, expecting to see the figure of the motorcyclist appear again. The days following that night at the campsite were a blur of anxiety. Even back in the safety of our home, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the routine with Emily, but I couldn't shake the idea that the motorcyclist, or whatever it was somehow connected to something deeper and more sinister. I started noticing small signs that made me uneasy. Every time I heard the sound of a motorcycle in the distance, my body would tense up, the fear returning full force. I noticed that even inside the house, there were moments when I felt that presence, like someone was there, watching. The paranoia began to take over me. I found myself locking the doors and windows repeatedly, checking them several times before going to bed. Then things started to get really strange. One day, while tidying up Emily's room, I noticed something out of place. One of her dolls was sitting in the window, facing the street, as if it was looking out. I knew I hadn't left it there. I asked Emily, but she denied moving the doll. I didn't think much of it at the time, but an uneasiness began to settle inside me. That night, after Emily went to bed, the familiar sound of a motorcycle in the distance put me on alert. I looked out the window but saw nothing. The motorcycle didn't seem to be approaching, but the sound continued, reverberating in my ears in a way that made me dizzy. It was as if the sound was inside my head, not outside. I closed the windows and drew the curtains, trying to push away the feeling that something was very wrong. When I went to bed, the room felt darker than usual. The silence of the night was heavy, almost suffocating, and my heart was racing uncontrollably, as if it sensed something bad was about to happen. I closed my eyes, trying to calm my thoughts, but then I heard a low noise, almost imperceptible, coming from Emily's room. I quickly got up and went to her room. When I opened the door, I saw her sleeping peacefully, but something caught my attention. In the corner of the room, where the light from the lamp didn't fully reach, the shadow of a tall figure seemed to form. It was as if the shadows were shaping into something, taking on a form that shouldn't have been there. I felt a chill run down my spine, and for a moment, I thought I was imagining things. But then the shadow moved. I was paralyzed. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The shadow seemed to creep along the wall, sliding towards Emily's bed. I felt a wave of panic, but also an overwhelming sense of helplessness. My mind was screaming for me to do something, but my body seemed stuck in place. All I could do was watch as the shadow got closer and closer until it stopped beside Emily's bed, as if it was looking at her. Finally, I managed to move. I ran to the bed and turned on all the lights. The shadow disappeared instantly, as if it had never been there. I woke Emily, who looked at me frightened, not understanding why I was so desperate. I tried not to alarm her, but it was clear that something terrible was happening. In the days that followed, the signs became more frequent. Emily's dolls were found in strange places, always facing out, as if they were waiting for something. I started hearing whispers in the middle of the night, words I couldn't understand, but that filled me with a deep and inexplicable fear. The house lights flickered for no reason, and whenever that happened, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. I started questioning my own sanity. Could it be that all the stress of the situation was making me see things? But then, one night, while watching TV in the living room, the sound of a motorcycle came back, louder than ever, sounding as if it was right at my door. I ran to the window, but there was nothing there. However, the sound continued, getting louder and louder, more intense, as if the motorcycle was circling inside my head. And that's when I understood, this wasn't just a motorcyclist, it wasn't just a figure from my past. There was something much more sinister at play. It was as if the presence that had started haunting us at the campsite had followed us here, bringing with it a darkness I didn't know how to fight. Something was trying to enter our lives, something that didn't belong in this world. I knew I couldn't keep going like this. It was only a matter of time before that presence did something to Emily, and that I couldn't allow. I decided that we had to leave everything behind and start over somewhere else. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't be the end. Something had been awakened, something that wouldn't be easily left behind. The next morning, as we prepared to leave, I saw a strange symbol drawn on the wall next to the front door. It was something I had never seen before, but I instinctively knew it was connected to that presence. The motorcycle didn't appear again, but the feeling of being watched was still there, stronger than ever. Finally, we left the house behind, moving to a new place, hoping the nightmare would end. For a while, everything seemed normal, as if we had escaped. But every now and then, I hear a distant sound, the roar of a motorcycle, and the fear comes back, taking hold of me. I don't know if I'll ever be able to completely escape from what haunted us that night, but I know that for now, all I can do is keep protecting Emily, hoping that presence never finds us again. A child and a stranger in the night in Texas. I grew up on a secluded farm in rural Texas, where the silence of the nights was interrupted only by the distant sounds of animals. I was just 10 years old at the time, living with my grandmother, an elderly and frail woman, but with a strength that only years of hard work on the land could give. My childhood was marked by the simplicity of country life, but also by one night in particular that still sends shivers down my spine. It was a hot summer night, one of those nights when the air feels heavy, and the darkness is deep, with no stars in the sky. I was already lying in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The windows in my room were open, letting in a light breeze along with the soft sounds of crickets and leaves rustling in the wind. It was a sound that always calmed me, but that night, something was different. Suddenly, I heard a noise that stood out among the night sounds. It was a light tapping, as if someone were knocking on my bedroom window. I stayed still, trying to figure out if it was my imagination or if there was really someone out there. The sound repeated, this time louder and more insistent. My heart started to race, and I knew something wasn't right. I got up slowly and walked to the window, careful not to make a sound. I peeked through the curtain, and at first, I didn't see anything but darkness. But then my eyes adjusted, and I saw a shadowy figure outside, standing there as if watching me. I couldn't make out its face or details of its appearance, but I knew it was someone, or something, waiting to be noticed. I backed away from the window, my body trembling with fear. I ran to my grandmother's room, where she was sleeping in her old wooden bed. I woke her quickly, trying to explain what was happening, but the words came out broken by fear. My grandmother, however, didn't seem as frightened as I was. She got up with a strange calm and started walking towards the front door. "It's him," she murmured, almost to herself. "He's come home." I didn't understand what she meant, but I knew something was very wrong. I ran after her, trying to stop her, but she was determined to open the door. "Grandma, no!" I shouted, grabbing her hand before she could turn the doorknob. "You can't open it, we don't know who it is." But she insisted it was my grandfather, her late husband, who had passed away years before. Desperation grew inside me. "Grandma, Grandpa's dead. He can't be out there." But she wouldn't listen, as if she were in some kind of trance. The sound at the window now seemed to be at the front door, a soft knock, almost like an invitation. The figure outside remained still, and the more I looked, the more certain I was that it wasn't human. Finally, I managed to pull her away from the door, dragging her back to the room. I locked the door and pushed the dresser in front of it, trying to create a barrier between us and whatever was outside. My grandmother sat on the bed, staring into nothingness, murmuring my grandfather's name. I sat beside her, my heart still racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The rest of the night passed in oppressive silence. The sound at the window and door eventually stopped, but the feeling that something was watching us remained. I couldn't sleep, just sat there, holding my grandmother's hand and waiting for the dawn to bring some safety. When the sun finally began to light up the room, the tension eased, but the fear lingered. In the days that followed, my grandmother avoided talking about what had happened. She seemed confused, as if she wasn't sure if it had all been real or just a dream. I, on the other hand, knew it had been very real. The shadowy figure outside, my grandmother's insistence on opening the door for someone who couldn't be my grandfather, everything told me that something was trying to enter our home that night. We never found out who, or what, was out there. There were no marks on the window or door, nothing to indicate that someone had been there. But the fear I felt that night never left me. Sometimes, on very quiet nights, I feel like that knock could return at any moment, as if the shadowy figure is still waiting for a chance to come in. My grandmother never mentioned that night again, and I avoided bringing it up, but whenever I hear an unexpected sound in the dark, I'm taken back to that night. I'm taken back to the moment when my grandmother, believing she was hearing my grandfather's call, almost opened the door to something that should never be invited in. This story has become one of those true horror stories that you carry with you, a dark reminder that there are things in the world we can't explain but that terrify us all the same. And even though I've grown up and moved far from that farm, the fear of that night still follows me, a constant reminder that sometimes, what knocks on our door in the darkness should never, under any circumstances, be let in. The Midnight Call. When I was 16, the calls started unexpectedly, always at midnight. At first, I thought it was just a bad prank. I'd pick up the phone, and on the other end, there'd be nothing but heavy breathing. It was unsettling, but I tried not to give it too much thought. However, the calls kept coming, night after night, and I began to wonder if there was more to it. I remember telling a friend about it, hoping he'd laugh and say I was overreacting. Instead, he suggested that next time, I should say something instead of staying silent. So, the next night, when the phone rang again, I took a deep breath and asked, "What do you want?" There was a brief silence before a low, calm voice replied, "I'm watching you." My heart stopped for a moment. I hung up immediately, fear gripping me completely. From that night on, the calls took on a new meaning. It was no longer just a simple prank, it was something personal, something that made me feel vulnerable and exposed. I tried to go about my life as usual, but the fear grew with each new call. That's when I started revisiting the past, trying to figure out who could be behind this. A memory I had always tried to bury began to resurface. When I was younger, there was a boy named David in my old neighborhood. He was younger than me, and for some reason, my friends and I used to pick on him. Now, years later, I began to wonder if he could be the one making these calls. David and his family moved away suddenly not long after we started teasing him. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, with these disturbing calls, I started to question whether our actions had caused more harm than we realized. Could David have spent all these years harboring resentment, waiting for the right moment to get back at me? As these memories surfaced, the panic grew. The thought that someone could have spent so much time planning revenge against me was both terrifying and heartbreaking. The calls continued, growing more threatening, and I began to realize that there was no escaping what was happening. I was being haunted by something I had created, something I had done to another human being. But the story didn't end there. As I delved deeper into my past and the actions I had taken, I started finding small signs that David, or whoever was behind this, wasn't just back to scare me, he wanted me to pay for what I'd done. Little things began happening in my daily life, things that could only have been done by someone who knew intimate details about me. The phone rang every night at midnight, and the voice on the other end was always the same, calm, controlled, but with an implied threat that kept me awake at night. I knew that changing my number wouldn't solve anything. Whoever was behind these calls was watching me closely, maybe even closer than I imagined. I began to notice that I was being followed, that small objects in my house were out of place when I got home from school. The calls were just the beginning. That figure from my past had returned to remind me that what I did wouldn't be forgotten so easily. It was more than just simple revenge, it was an obsession that I had planted, and now I was reaping the consequences of my actions. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted by something I couldn't control, became unbearable. As the weeks passed, the calls became a dark, constant part of my life. I knew that changing my number wouldn't solve the problem, so I tried to ignore the calls, letting the phone ring until the person gave up. But the sound of the phone in the silence of the night, always at the same relentless time, kept me in a constant state of anxiety. And even when the phone didn't ring, the feeling of being watched remained, like a shadow that refused to leave me. Things started to escalate in ways I didn't expect. Small changes in my daily routine began to bother me. Things I knew where I had left, like my car keys or a notebook, would appear in different places, as if someone was messing with my stuff. At first, I thought it might be my own distraction, but the more it happened, the clearer it became that someone was invading my privacy. The feeling of being followed intensified. When I left the house, I had the impression that someone was watching me from afar, like a presence that was always there, lurking. Sometimes, it felt like invisible eyes were fixed on me as I walked down the street or did my shopping. I started avoiding going out at night, and when I did, my eyes would scan every corner, looking for any sign that someone was following me. One night, I woke up with the feeling that someone was in my room. It wasn't the first time I'd had this impression, but this time it felt more real, more tangible. I lay in bed, unable to move, my heart beating so hard it seemed to echo through the room. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was being paranoid. But then I heard what sounded like a faint whisper, so low it was barely audible, but it was there. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was threatening. When I finally mustered the courage to turn on the light, the room was empty. There was no one there, but the feeling that something was wrong was overwhelming. That's when I realized this was no longer just about the calls. Fear had infiltrated every aspect of my life, and I was beginning to lose my grip on what was real and what was a product of my terrified mind. As the days passed, I started to notice that this feeling of being watched wasn't limited to the night or the calls. It was there during the day, at school, at work, even when I was with friends. It felt like something or someone was always with me, watching every move I made. My friends began to notice that I was distant, that something was deeply affecting me, but I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. I decided to install security cameras in my house, hoping to capture any evidence of who was harassing me. But the recordings only showed emptiness, a silence that was even more disturbing. It was as if whoever it was knew exactly where the cameras were, as if they were toying with me, driving my paranoia higher every day. I started losing weight, sleeping less and less, my mind always on alert, waiting for the next sign that I was being watched. Every movement in the shadows, every noise in the house, turned into a warning that something was wrong. And even though I tried to rationalize everything, part of me knew there was something real, something that couldn't be ignored or explained away. Then I began to realize that this figure, this presence, wasn't just watching me, it was getting closer. Small signs started to appear in my house, like scratch marks on doors and walls, strange symbols I didn't recognize, but that filled me with panic. It was as if this figure was slowly invading my space, preparing for something I couldn't understand. One night, the feeling of being watched became so strong that I could hardly breathe. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and that's when I heard the whisper again, clearer this time. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was laced with malice. A chill ran down my spine, and when I looked at the darkest corner of the room, I thought I saw a shadow denser than usual, something that seemed to have a shape. Panic seized me. I rushed to the switch and turned on all the lights, but when the room was flooded with light, the shadow was gone. I was alone, but the fear was as real as anything tangible. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just a haunting anymore, it was a total invasion of my life. Something or someone was trying to break me, to push me to the brink of sanity. The decision to move became inevitable. No matter how much I tried to protect myself, it seemed this presence was always one step ahead. I left the apartment, moved to another city, trying to leave it all behind. And for a while, it worked. The sensations faded, the paranoia slowly dissipated, and I began to recover a part of myself that I had lost. But the fear never completely disappeared. There are still nights when, as I turn off the lights, I feel that old sensation of being watched. As if the figure is still out there, waiting for a chance to return. And in that moment, I realize that no matter how much I try to escape, no matter how far I move, something stayed with me. Something that will always be lurking, in the shadows, waiting to remind me that I'm never truly alone. If you enjoyed these true horror stories, you won't want to miss the next video. Check out the 10 most terrifying true horror stories of August 2024 compilation by clicking the card on the screen or by finding it as the previous video on our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience. We'd love to hear your stories. Stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video.